The morning Elira Vale was cast out of Iron Hollow territory, the snow had not yet decided to fall. It was gathering itself, thickening in the clouds above the mountain peaks like something patient, something that knew it would not need to hurry. Winter had already done its damage without a single flake. It had arrived 3 weeks early in the northern range, and it carried the kind of cold that did not announce itself. It did not roar or bite. It simply entered. It found Elira first. It moved through the thin fabric of her coat the way water moves through cracked stone, not forcing, not violent, just inevitable. The coat was pale grey and too small. It had been too small since summer, but no one had thought to replace it. The cold slid beneath the collar, crossed her collarbone, and settled into her chest with the quiet authority of something that had always belonged there. By the time Elira reached the center of the courtyard, the cold had already made itself at home in her ribs. She felt it. She simply did not let it show. Elira stood in the heart of Iron Hollow's territory grounds, 10 years old and trembling, though only half of it was cold. The other half had a name she would not speak aloud. Around her, the pack had gathered to watch. Iron Hollow was not built on warmth. It had never pretended to be. It was a pack carved from stone and obedience, a hierarchy maintained through strength and the absence of mercy. Warriors lined the perimeter of the grounds, thick-armed and still, their breath rising in slow columns of white vapor. They watched the way wolves always watch something small in an open space, not with cruelty. Exactly, with assessment. She could smell them. Leather and pine resin and the metallic edge of dominance. They could smell her. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. Behind her, smoke curled from the great hall chimney. It carried the scent of the morning meal, roasted meat, salted broth, the warm yeast of bread that had risen in the early hours before dawn. Elira had been the one to tend the fire in the kitchen that morning. She had done it every morning for 3 years, rising before the sky lightened, working quietly so she would not disturb anyone. She had ladled the broth. She had set the bread to prove. She would not eat any of it. At the far edge of the courtyard, elevated on the stone steps of the pack hall, stood Alpha Dren. He was a large man, broad through the shoulder, grey-eyed, with a jaw set so firmly it might have been cut from the same mountain behind him. He had the look of someone who had never once questioned a decision he had made, because questioning would suggest the possibility of error, and Alpha Dren did not entertain possibilities. He rested one forearm on the stone pillar beside him, almost casual. Like this was administrative. Like this was paperwork. His eyes moved to Elira with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided everything. "An omega without a viable scent marker is a liability," he said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The courtyard had gone so quiet that the distant creak of pine trees in the mountain wind was audible between his words. A drain on the resources of a pack that has spent 3 years feeding her and receiving nothing. Elira said nothing. She had learned, early on, that silence was not weakness. Silence was the only armor she had ever been given. She held it around herself now the way she held the thin coat, inadequate, imperfect, but hers. Her eyes moved once to her left. Her mother stood at the edge of the crowd. She was looking somewhere past Elira's shoulder, at something in the middle distance that did not exist. Her expression was the careful blankness of a woman who had decided that what was happening was not, in fact, happening to her. Her father was not there. He had found something to attend to in another part of the territory before sunrise. Alpha Dren continued. "Pack law does not provide for omegas who contribute nothing. It does not permit sentiment to outweigh survival. Every wolf in Iron Hollow earns their place." He paused. His golden eyes returned to Elira with something that was not quite contempt. Contempt would have required caring. She has not earned hers. A murmur moved through the watching pack like a slow exhale. Elira gripped the strap of the small pack hanging from her right hand. Inside it, one spare set of clothes. A half loaf of bread she had taken from the kitchen before anyone was awake, not stolen, she told herself. Ode, a single grey stone, smooth and flat, that she had carried since she was 7 years old, for no reason she could name, except that it felt like something permanent in a life that had never offered her much of that. Everything she owned fit in one hand. "Remove her scent marker," Alphadren said. She had not expected that part. She should have. The pack elder stepped forward. The process was brief and efficient, and she would not describe it later, not even to herself, because some things become smaller when you refuse to give them words. When it was done, Illyra felt like an erasure, like something that had almost been a name. The gates of Iron Hollow opened behind her. Not wide, just enough to make the meaning clear. She walked through them without being pushed. She would give no one the satisfaction of the image. The gates closed. No one called after her. Not a voice, not a sound. Above the tree line, the clouds finally made their decision. The snow began to fall. The snow did not fall gently. It never did, this far north. It came in sheets sideways, then diagonal, then sideways again, driven by a wind that seemed to have no origin point and no destination, only the singular purpose of finding every exposed surface and stripping it of warmth. Within minutes of the Iron Hollow gates closing behind her, Illyra's face was wet. Within 10, she could no longer feel her ears. She walked anyway. There was no direction. That was the first thing she understood about the wilderness. It did not offer directions. It offered trees and dark, and the sound of the wind moving through branches like something breathing. She picked a line through the forest and held it, not because it was the right line, but because changing course required a kind of decision-making that her mind was no longer capable of. 1 foot, then the next. The snow came up past her ankles in the deeper drifts, and each step cost more than the last, and she did not think about that. She thought about the stone in her pack, smooth and flat and permanent. She thought about nothing else. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I'd love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The cold moved deeper as the light failed. She had not understood, before tonight, how many different registers cold had. There was the cold of early morning kitchens, before the fire caught unpleasant, manageable. There was the cold of standing too long near an open window in winter. She had known those colds. She had considered them hardships. This was different. This cold was not interested in her discomfort. It was interested in her core. It worked methodically, peeling back layers, skin, then muscle, then something deeper that she did not have a name for, and making itself at home in each one. Her fingers went first. Not painful. Exactly. Toward the end. Just absent. She looked down at her hands, and they were there, gripping the strap of her pack. But the information of them had stopped reaching her. Her feet came next. She did not realize they were bleeding until she stopped to adjust the pack strap and looked down at the snow behind her. The prints she had left were not clean. They were tinged at the edges with something dark, where the thin soles of her shoes had given way to the ice-crusted ground beneath the snowpack. She stared at the prints for a moment. Then she looked forward. Then she walked. She did not have the option of stopping. The howl came from her left, long and low and conversational, the kind of howl that was not a warning but a location marker. "I am here. Where are you?" A second voice answered from somewhere further north, then a third, closer than either of the first two. Wolves. Not pack wolves. Wild ones. The distinction mattered enormously, and she had understood it even at 10 years old, because wild wolves did not observe pack law, and pack law was the only thing that had ever offered her even theoretical protection. Protection she had now been stripped of, entirely. Her legs moved faster. Not quite running. Running in this depth of snow was not running. It was lurching, stumbling, burning through the last of whatever her body was still holding in reserve. But faster. The howls did not follow immediately. Wild wolves were cautious, curious, first. Cautious. She could not afford to wait for curiosity to become something else. She fell 3 times in the next hour. The first time, she caught herself on her palms, and the ice opened the skin at the base of her right hand, and she pushed upright and kept moving. The second time, her knee hit something buried beneath the snow, a root, a stone. She never knew, and the pain shot up through her thigh, and she bit the inside of her cheek and stood. The third time, she did not catch herself. She went down sideways into a drift, and the snow closed around her face. and for one terrible moment, she felt how easy it would be to simply remain there. The snow was cold, but it was also quiet. It muffled the wind. It muffled the howls. It muffled everything, and she was so tired, and the cold had stopped feeling like cold, and had started feeling like the slow removal of weight she had been carrying too long. She pushed herself up. She did not allow herself to understand how close that moment had been. It was when she lifted her head, blinking snow from her lashes, that she saw it. She almost dismissed it. Her mind, in its exhaustion, almost filed it under trick of the dark and moved on. But she looked again, through the trees perhaps 40 meters ahead, perhaps less a shape that was not tree-shaped, a vertical line, a right angle, the geometry of something built, not grown. She blinked the snow from her eyes and held her breath, and looked until the shape resolved itself into something she could name. A cabin. It sat at the edge of a small clearing as though it had arrived there by accident and never found reason to leave. The roof sagged heavily on one side, bowed under the accumulated weight of many winters. One wall leaned slightly inward, like a tired thing holding itself upright through stubbornness alone. The door hung at a crooked angle, open a few inches, creaking in the wind, not welcoming. Exactly, but not closed. The snow had buried the lower third of the structure almost entirely. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the gaps of the wood, no sound from within. Abandoned. Elira's legs moved before she had made a decision. She crossed the clearing in a stumbling half-run, shouldered through the crooked door, and stepped into the dark. The wind stayed outside. She made it 2 steps before her knees gave out entirely, and she went down onto the cold wooden floor and did not get up. She lay there with her cheek against the frost-dusted boards, her breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls, her pack still gripped in one bloodied hand. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls. Inside, there was only silence, dust, the ghost smell of old wood and dead fires. It was not safety, but it was not death. The first week, she cried. Not constantly. Not in the way of someone who had given up. Elira did not have the luxury of giving up, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the cold and the hollow ache of hunger, she understood that clearly. But in the thin grey hours before dawn, when the wind found new gaps in the cabin walls and the darkness felt absolute, the tears came without permission, quietly. She allowed them that much. By the second week, they had stopped. Not because the grief had left, it hadn't. But crying required a kind of softness, a belief, however small, that someone might hear and respond. Elira had stopped believing that. She was not sure she mourned the belief. It had never done much for her. What replaced it was simpler, harder, cleaner. What do I need? What do I have? What do I do next? Fire came first, because without fire there was nothing else. The cabin had a stove cast iron, rusted through in one corner, its pipe disconnected from the chimney flue. She spent the better part of 2 days on her hands and knees figuring out how to reconnect it, working with fingers that still ached from the frostbite of her first night, using a length of warped metal she pried from a broken shelf bracket. There was old kindling in a rotted crate beside the stove, barely usable. Barely was enough. The striking was harder. She had found 2 stones in the clearing that looked right dark, fine-grained, with edges that caught the light. She had seen fire striking done once, briefly, by an older pack member who had considered it a hobby rather than a necessity, and she carried that single memory into hours of effort. Her knuckles split against the stones on the 3rd attempt, on the 11th, on the 19th. She bled on the kindling and kept going because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not a decision she was prepared to make. On the 23rd attempt, a spark caught. She bent over it and breathed with the careful precision of someone diffusing something dangerous. The flame climbed, small, uncertain, impossibly precious. She fed it splinters, then larger pieces, then held her bleeding hands above it and felt the warmth move into her palms like something being returned. She did not celebrate. She noted it, filed it. I can make fire. What's next? Water was straightforward, once she understood the logic. Snow packed into the rusted pot she had found beneath the broken shelves. Pot onto the stove. Wait. The logic was simple. The patience required was not. She learned to keep the pot filled and the fire low, a constant, quiet management that became its own kind of rhythm over the first weeks. Food was harder. She foraged first, working in expanding circles from the cabin during the hours when the light was strongest and the cold slightly less absolute. Frozen berries, still clinging to a bush, she found 30 meters into the tree line. The inner bark of a birch tree, which she had heard once was edible and discovered, on testing, was barely so. Roots she could not always identify, which she ate anyway and paid for sometimes and did not pay for other times, and she learned the difference gradually. Trapping came later. She built her first snare from a technique she half remembered and half invented, using stripped bark and a bent sapling branch. It took 4 attempts before the tension was right. The first successful catch, a small, dark-furred animal she could not name, she skinned with a shard of broken shelf glass and cooked over the stove and ate entirely, without ceremony, because ceremony was a habit of people who had enough. She was learning to have enough. Slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly. It was somewhere in the 2nd month that she noticed the forest. Not the practical forest, the trees she moved through, the ground she read for animal tracks, the sky she checked for weather through the gaps in the canopy. She had learned that forest quickly. She meant the other one. The one that seemed to notice her back. It was subtle. The way the tree line held a particular stillness when she moved through it, as though something had just finished watching and resumed its stillness at her arrival. The way the wind sometimes dropped entirely around the cabin, not because of the geography. She didn't think, but as if something had decided to grant a brief reprieve. The way the cabin itself seemed, in the quietest moments, to breathe. She did not examine the feeling closely. She had enough to examine, but she did not dismiss it either. One night, when the fire had burned to embers and the dark pressed soft against the cabin walls, she realized she had not spoken a word aloud in over 3 weeks. Not to herself, not to the forest, not to anything. It alarmed her, in a way the hunger and cold had not. She sat up on the cot she had repaired it, roughly, with salvaged materials, and in the near dark of the dying fire, she opened her mouth. Elira. Her voice was rough from disuse, strange to her own ears, smaller than she remembered it being. She said it again, more steadily. Elira Vale. The cabin held the sound for a moment. Then the wind moved through the eaves, quiet, almost gentle, and the embers shifted in the stove, and the dark settled back around her like something that had simply been waiting for her to finish. She lay back down. She did not forget her name again. The storm arrived without warning. That was the first thing wrong with it. Elira had spent months learning to read the northern sky, the particular heaviness that gathered at the tree line before snowfall, the way the wind shifted direction an hour before a serious weather system moved through. She had learned to prepare, to bank the fire early, reinforce the gap beneath the door with strips of bark, move her water supply away from the coldest wall. She had done none of those things tonight, because tonight the sky had been clear at dusk. Stars sharp and numerous, the moon full and pale above the mountain peaks. She had banked the fire anyway habit, and settled onto the cot with the intention of sleeping. The storm hit at what she judged to be just past midnight, not built gradually, not announced. It simply arrived, a wall of wind that struck the cabin broadside with a force that snapped her upright on the cot before she had fully processed the sound. The walls shuddered. Something on the roof tore loose and was gone. The fire in the stove guttered violently as the chimney pipe howled with a pitch she had never heard it make, and then the temperature inside the cabin dropped by several degrees in the span of a breath, and the whole structure, the entire groaning, patched, stubborn thing lurched. Elira was on her feet. She crossed to the door first. The wind had found new gaps somewhere in the night and was pouring through them in thin, knife-edged streams. She pressed her back against the door and felt the storm testing it. Outside, the trees screamed. Something large, a branch, a trunk, She couldn't know crashed to the ground close enough that she felt the vibration through the floorboards. Through the floorboards. She dropped her gaze. Beneath her left foot, something had shifted. The board she was standing on had tilted slightly, not breaking, not rotting, but moving, as though released from pressure, the way a key sometimes turns when the mechanism inside finally aligns. She stepped back, looked down. A gap, no wider than 2 fingers, running along the left edge of the board in a line too clean to be decay. She crouched. The storm continued overhead. The cabin shook. She barely noticed. Her fingers found the edge of the board and pulled, and the board lifted smoothly on a hidden pivot point, as though it had been designed to open this way and had simply been waiting for the right hands. Beneath it was a compartment, roughly cut from the subfloor, approximately the length of her forearm and half as wide. Inside, a roll of parchment, bound with a cord that had stiffened with age, but not crumbled. Beneath the parchment, etched directly into a flat piece of dark stone, fitted into the base of the compartment markings. She looked at them for a long moment. They were not letters, not any alphabet she had encountered in the 2 books she owned, not the pack script she had learned in Iron Hollow before she stopped being considered worth educating. They were something older than script, symbols composed of lines that curved and intersected with a precision that suggested intention, that suggested someone had known exactly what they were drawing and why. They covered the entire surface of the stone in concentric arrangements that drew the eye toward the center, where the markings grew densest, most deliberate. The moon was at the window. The moonlight found the compartment. The markings began to glow, not brightly, not dramatically. A faint luminescence, blue-gray, the color of light through deep ice, like the symbols were not producing light so much as remembering it, like they had stored moonlight for a long time, and were simply releasing what they had kept. Illyra should have pulled her hand back. She reached in and pressed her palm flat against the stone. The warmth was immediate, not the warmth of fire, not surface heat, not the warmth of friction or contact. This moved through her hand and up her wrist and along her arm and into her chest in a single, steady wave, like something recognizing her. The split skin on her knuckles, still healing, still tender from weeks of work, stopped hurting. The ache in her feet, constant since the first night, went quiet. The cold that had lived in her ribs since the moment she walked through Iron Hollow's gate and had never fully left, not even in the warmest hours beside the stove, it was gone. She knelt on the trembling floor of the cabin, with her palm pressed to the glowing stone and the storm raging above her, and felt, for the first time since she could clearly remember, warm, not just on the surface, not just in her hands, entirely, completely, deeply warm. Something in the stone pulsed once, slowly, beneath her palm. Something in her chest pulsed back. She did not move her hand. She did not speak. Outside, the storm pressed on. For the first time since her exile, the cold did not reach her. 5 years passed. The mountain kept count in the way mountains do not in days or seasons, but in the slow accumulation of change. The birch tree at the edge of the clearing added 5 rings to its interior dark. The cabin settled further into the earth on its eastern side, the way old things eventually stop resisting gravity and simply lean into it. The hidden stone beneath the floorboards pulsed with its faint luminescence every full moon, steady and patient, like a heartbeat that had decided on a rhythm and saw no reason to alter it. Illyra changed faster than any of it. She was 17 now, though the number felt arbitrary, a piece of arithmetic rather than an identity. She tracked her age the way she tracked the weather, as information, useful for planning, not particularly personal. What was personal was what she had become. She moved through the forest differently than she had at 10. Not carefully implied fear of getting something wrong, and she no longer approached the northern wilderness with fear. She moved through it the way water moves through a familiar channel, without hesitation, without wasted motion, reading the ground and the canopy and the wind simultaneously and adjusting without thinking. Her hands, which had bled so readily in those first weeks, were calloused now, capable. She could build a fire in under 2 minutes in wet conditions, set and check a trap line across half a kilometer of forest, identify 17 edible plants by touch, alone in the dark. She had grown tall, lean in the way of people who earn every calorie. Her face had shed the softness of childhood into something quieter and more considered, not hard, exactly, settled, like a landscape after a long winter that has finally decided it is finished proving something. She spoke very little. There was no one to speak to, but she had not stopped saying her own name aloud at least once each day. It had become ritual, like banking the fire, something that kept the shape of herself intact. The change in her scent had come gradually enough that she almost missed it. She had first noticed it in others' reactions. The fox that had startled away from her for 2 full years began, one autumn morning, to simply sit at the edge of the clearing and watch her work. Then closer. Then, eventually, it had eaten from her hand with the relaxed attention of something that understood. It had nothing to fear, not from her, not from anything near her. A young elk, injured, had sheltered against the cabin's eastern wall for 3 days one February, and emerged healed beyond what she could explain, because she had not touched it and had nothing to offer it except proximity. The ravens were the most direct about it. They came first in 1s and 2s and eventually in a loose, rotating attendance, settling in the spruce trees above the cabin, watching her with their flat, intelligent eyes. They brought her things sometimes, small and impractical things, a piece of smooth glass, a fragment of antler, a stone with an unusual color. She kept them on the shelf above the stove in a line. She was not sure what the arrangement meant to the ravens. She was not sure it needed to mean anything. The storms she understood less. She only knew that in her first years at the cabin, she had tracked and prepared for every significant weather system, some of which had struck with real violence. In the past 2 years, the worst of them seemed to soften at a certain distance from the clearing. Not stop, not reverse, but reduce, as though something at the perimeter absorbed the sharpest edge of them before they arrived. She had no framework for this. She filed it beside the elk and the ravens, and the glowing stone, and the warmth that had never fully left her chest since the night she touched it. She did not have answers. She had observations, and she had a growing sense, careful, quiet, not yet fully examined, that she was no longer the same category of thing she had been when Iron Hollow pushed her through its gate. She had arrived here, broken and erasable, a child with a faint scent and no name worth keeping. Whatever she was now had a different scent entirely. She knew this the way she knew most things about herself, indirectly, through evidence, the way the forest oriented toward her when she walked, the way her own skin carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the season. She could not smell herself the way others could. That was the particular blindness of being inside your own presence. But she understood, from the behavior of every living thing around her, that whatever she carried now was not faint. It was not defective. It was not ignorable. The hunters came from the south, following a trade route that cut through the lower range. She heard them before she saw them. 2 of them, working the tree line with the practiced efficiency of men who tracked for a living. She watched from the shadow of the spruce canopy, still and patient. As they worked 100 meters below the clearing, they stopped at the same moment. Both of them, heads lifting, nostrils flaring with the instinct that was older than language in their kind. One of them turned slowly, scanning the tree line above. He could not see her. The distance was too great and the shadows too deep, but he stood very still for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has caught a sound. They cannot place something between recognition and confusion, and the particular unease of encountering something that does not fit the categories they have built for the world. He said something to the other hunter in a low voice. The other hunter nodded slowly, his eyes moving up the mountain slope. Then they moved on, but they moved on differently than they had arrived. This chapter belongs, for a time, to someone else. Alpha Kale Draven did not track things. Things were tracked for him by scouts who reported back in careful, measured language, by hunters who understood that incomplete information was more dangerous than silence, by a network of contacts spanning 6 territories who knew that the cost of wasting Kale's time was considerably higher than the cost of thoroughness. He received information. He made decisions. He did not pursue. He had not pursued anything in years, because nothing had required it. The Northern Territories had arranged themselves around him the way smaller bodies arrange themselves around a gravitational center, not out of affection, not out of alliance, but out of the clear-eyed pragmatism of packs that had done the arithmetic and understood what resisting Kale Draven would cost them. He was 31 years old and had been alpha of Darkfen territory for 9 of those years, having taken it at 22 in a succession that most packs in the north still discussed in the same tone they used for significant weather events. Not because it had been brutal, though it had been, but because of the particular quality of his stillness throughout it. Most alphas, in consolidating power, displayed something. Anger, perhaps. Triumph. The visible relief of ambition finally satisfied. Kale had displayed nothing. He simply became alpha the way winter became winter, not by announcing itself, but by the world waking one morning and finding the change already complete. In the years since, he had maintained Darkfen with the same quality of attention, efficient, unsentimental. He asked of his pack what was reasonable and enforced it without theatre. In return, Darkfen was fed, protected, and unbothered by the kinds of territorial disputes that occupied the attention of lesser-run packs to the east. His wolves did not love him the way pack wolves sometimes love their alphas. They trusted him, which was rarer and more durable. He did not require more than that. He was at the northern edge of his territory when he caught it. It was a Thursday in late October. Though he was not tracking days that week, he was tracking the boundary markers along the upper ridge, a task he performed personally twice a year because boundaries were too important to delegate entirely. His 2 scouts were 20 meters behind him, professional enough to maintain distance and silence while he worked. The wind came from the northwest. He stopped. The scouts stopped behind him, reading his posture the way trained men read posture immediately, accurately, without needing to understand what had caused it. Kale stood very still and breathed. The scent was faint at this distance, faint enough that a less attentive nose might have filed it under background forest and moved on. But Kale's attention was, at all times, precise, and the scent had arrived with a quality that bypassed the analytical part of his mind entirely and struck something considerably deeper before he had even begun to categorize it. He catalogued it slowly, working backwards from the impression to the components. Warmth. Not the warmth of an active fire or a living body in exertion, something older than that. The warmth of deep earth in summer, of stone that has held the sun for months and releases it slowly through the night. Pine resin, forest floor, cold water, beneath all of it. Something he had no name for. Something that resonated at a frequency below language. He had catalogued the scents of hundreds of wolves in his life. Omegas, betas, alphas, packless wolves, rivals, allies. He understood scent the way a musician understands pitch as information. Layered and meaningful, telling him things about origin and status and strength and threat level within the first breath. This one told him nothing he had been prepared to hear. It did not smell like an omega. It did not smell like a threat. It did not smell like a rival or an ally or anything within the framework. He had spent 31 years building for exactly this kind of assessment. It smelled like something that had been looking for him. That thought arrived without his permission, and he examined it with the same flat attention he gave everything else, waiting for it to resolve into something more rational. It did not resolve. The pull was quiet but absolute, the way the pull of deep water is quiet, not dramatic, not violent, just a steady and irresistible orientation toward a specific direction that made all other directions feel. Suddenly, beside the point, he turned northwest. The upper ridge boundary could wait. He noted the thought. The abnormality of it Kale Draven did not postpone. He did not deviate from planned tasks for sensory impressions. He had built his entire reputation, his entire tenure as alpha, on the principle that feeling was information, and information was to be processed, not obeyed. He turned northwest anyway. "Return to the pack house," he said to the scouts. His voice was its usual register level, final, expecting no discussion. "Alpha, I'll follow when I'm done." A pause. Then the sound of 2 sets of feet moving south. They were good scouts. They understood that some things were above their clearance level. Cale stood alone at the edge of his territory with his face into the northwest wind and breathed the impossible scent and felt something shift in the bedrock of his composure. Not breaking, not cracking, just shifting, acknowledging something it had been waiting a long time to acknowledge. Then he moved, north, into the wilderness, into the range he did not know, following something that felt, with a certainty he could not dismantle, like it had always been his to find. Elira felt it before she understood it. She was at the eastern tree line when it happened, checking the second snare on her morning round, her breath visible in the cold air, her movements their usual economy of purpose. The snare was empty. She reset it, straightened, and turned back toward the cabin. She stopped. The forest had gone quiet, not the ordinary quiet of winter mornings, which had its own texture, the muffled stillness of snow-weighted branches, the occasional crack of frozen wood, the distant movement of wind through the upper canopy. She knew that quiet the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had lived inside it for 5 years. This was different. This was the silence of something that had been making sound a moment ago, and had now, collectively, decided to stop. The ravens were gone from the spruce trees. She had not heard them leave. She stood very still and listened to the absence of everything, and felt the hairs rise along the back of her neck, with the slow, certain deliberateness of a warning she did not yet have words for. Something was coming. She returned to the cabin at a pace that was not quite running, and told herself it was the cold that had made her move faster. Inside, she went still, immediately. The compartment beneath the floor had been closed since the night she discovered it. She had replaced the board carefully, reverently, understanding on some wordless level that the stone beneath was not a thing to be left casually open to the air. But now, with the board sealed and the floor undisturbed, a faint light traced the edges of the hidden panel like moonlight finding a crack. There was no moon. It was mid-morning. She crouched and pressed her palm to the floorboard and felt the warmth radiating upward through the wood, steady, urgent, like a pulse that had quickened. Not threatening, not the warmth of danger, but alert. The warmth of something that had been waiting quietly for a long time and had now lifted its head. She stood slowly. The air inside the cabin had changed weight. She could not have explained it to anyone who had not spent years learning to read this specific space. But the cabin had a quality to its air that she had come to understand, the way she understood weather. It had moods, pressures, small atmospheric shifts that preceded events the way certain cloud formations preceded storms. Right now the air was heavy in a way it had never been before. Not oppressive, not dangerous, anticipatory. She moved to the window, a gap in the wall she had covered with a stretched piece of hide cured to near translucency, and looked out at the clearing. Empty, snow-covered. Still, the tree line beyond it, motionless. And yet, she pressed one hand flat against the cabin wall beside the window and felt it the faintest vibration, deeper than sound, like the cabin itself was attending to something at a distance. She had felt the structure settle, felt it respond to storms, felt it breathe in the way she had never found a rational explanation for, and had stopped requiring one. She had never felt it do this. She had never felt it focus. Cale reached the edge of the clearing just past midday. He stopped at the tree line and looked at the cabin for a long time without moving. He was not a man given to uncertainty, and what he felt standing at the perimeter of that small clearing was not, precisely, uncertainty. It was something more structural than that. It was the sensation of arriving somewhere he had not known existed, and finding, on arrival, that some part of him recognized it. The cabin was not impressive. He had seen ruins in better condition. It leaned. Its roof was a study in managed collapse. The door hung at an angle that suggested the hinges had long since given up on precise geometry. Snow had consumed the base of it and not been cleared, not because no one had cleared it. He revised, reading the patterns more carefully, but because clearing that particular accumulation served as insulation. And whoever lived here understood that. Someone lived here. He read it in the details the way he read everything through evidence rather than assumption. The chimney pipe, repaired with materials that didn't match the original but worked. The snare stake visible at the clearing's eastern edge. set by hands that knew what they were doing. The hide stretched across the wall gap that faced north, positioned to block wind rather than maximize light. Someone had built a functional life inside this ruin. He took one step into the clearing and stopped. The air changed. He felt it across his skin, first a pressure, subtle and sourceless, like the atmosphere had thickened by a single degree. His wolf rose in his chest, not in aggression, not in the posture it assumed before a confrontation. In the posture it assumed before something it did not have a category for. Below the snow, something was glowing. He looked down. Beneath his feet the ground was ordinary packed snow, but at the center of the clearing, faint as a held breath, a pattern of light traced itself through the frozen ground there and almost not there, the color of ice over deep water. He did not move toward the door. He waited. Inside the cabin, Elira had already put on her boots. She had known, from the moment the clearing changed, that going to the window or waiting behind the wall was not what this moment required. She could feel the presence at the tree line with the same quiet specificity that she felt incoming weather. Large, controlled, entirely unlike the hunters she had watched from the shadows of the spruce canopy. This was not someone passing through. She lifted the bar from the door, pushed it open against the weight of cold air outside, and stepped out into the clearing. They looked at each other across the clearing. Snow had begun to fall, not the violent, sideways snow of northern storms, but something quieter, vertical, deliberate, the kind of snowfall that seemed less like weather and more like the world choosing to mark a moment. Elira stood at the cabin door with her hands loose at her sides and her breath rising in slow, even columns. She had expected, when she pushed the door open, to feel fear. She had catalogued fear carefully over the years, its texture, its uses, its relationship to actual danger, which was not always what it claimed. She felt none of it now. What she felt was closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of the stone in the compartment below, just before she touched it, the sense of a threshold, the understanding that what came next would not be reversible. He stood at the tree line with the stillness of something that had never needed to announce itself. Tall, dark-coated, built like the mountain behind him, not massive for its own sake, but permanent, the kind of presence that didn't fill a space so much as establish its center. His eyes were on hers. She did not look away. Neither did he. The snow fell between them, unhurried, indifferent to what it was witnessing. He crossed the clearing first, not quickly, not with the aggressive deliberateness of a challenge. He moved like a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to perform it. He stopped at a distance that was closer than strangers stood, and further than she would have permitted from anyone who felt like a threat. He did not feel like a threat. That was the strangest thing. She had spent 5 years developing an accurate and finely calibrated sense of danger, and it was not sounding now. What it was doing instead she did not have a name for. He studied her with eyes that were doing exactly what her own were doing, reading, cataloging, revising prior assumptions against present evidence. She saw the revision happening in real time. Whatever he had expected to find at the end of the scent trail, it had not been this. "You've been hiding," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone who had spent years ensuring that nothing came out of him that he had not first decided to release. "I was surviving," Elira said. A silence. Something moved in his expression, not softening. Exactly. More like a recalibration. The faintest acknowledgement of a distinction that mattered. How long? 5 years. He looked at the cabin, looked back at her. She watched him understand what 5 years in this structure meant, what it had required, what it said about the person standing in front of him. She watched the understanding land. "Alone," he said. It was not a question. "Alone," she confirmed. The bond arrived without ceremony. She felt it first as a warmth familiar, because warmth had lived in her chest since the night she touched the stone, but different in direction. That warmth moved outward from her. This warmth moved toward. It crossed the distance between them like a current finding its ground, and when it arrived it did not crash or overwhelm. It settled, with the unhurried certainty of something that had always known where it was going, and had simply been waiting for the geography to align. She saw it reach him at the same moment. His stillness changed quality. He was still not moving, but the nature of his stillness shifted from chosen to necessary, the stillness of someone absorbing something too significant for motion. She had heard about mate bonds her entire childhood. The pack had spoken of them in the particular register they used for things that were both sacred and hierarchical. A dominant pull, they said, an overpowering of the lesser wolf's instincts toward the stronger. An alpha's claim made biological. This was not that. There was no pull of dominance, no instinct toward submission rising in her bones. What moved between them was equal in both directions, a recognition that did not rank, that did not arrange them into a hierarchy, but simply, plainly, connected them. Like two rivers that had been moving through different terrain and had arrived, without planning it, at the same body of water. She met his gaze and he met hers, and neither of them looked away, and neither of them looked down. Then the ground moved, not violently, not like an earthquake, like a breath, a single deep exhalation from somewhere far below the snow and the frozen earth and the bedrock of the mountain itself. The light came up through the ground in the same pattern she had seen traced faintly when Kale had stood at the clearing's edge, but fully now bright and certain. Runes she had spent 5 years memorizing, etched in cold fire across the snow surface in a circle that encompassed them both. Elira had time to look down at them. Then her knees gave out. She did not fall into darkness she fell into before. Wolves she had never seen, enormous, pale, moving through a forest older than any forest she had known, running not in packs but in procession, deliberate and ceremonial, toward a mountain that looked like this mountain before the centuries had worked on it. Among them, moving with the same quality of procession, figures that were neither fully wolf nor fully human, but held the threshold between the two with a calm that suggested they had chosen it rather than been caught there. Guardians, some part of her understood, not warriors, not rulers, guardians of the living pulse of the land itself, the thing that kept the prey abundant and the injured healed, and the worst of the storms from becoming something unsurvivable. She saw them pass their purpose forward, generation by generation, through bloodlines that grew thinner as the centuries compressed them, until a line so diluted it registered as barely there, as defective, as an omega without a viable scent marker, not worth the resources of a pack that measured value in force. She saw herself, not as she had been at 10, small and trembling in a courtyard, as she was now as she appeared from the outside, which she had never been able to see, standing in a clearing in the snow, with light rising from the ground beneath her feet, and the forest oriented around her like a compass, finding north. Heart of the wild, the vision said. Not in words, in the way truth sometimes arrives below language, below argument, directly into the place in the chest where the things that cannot be undone are kept. Not Omega, not Luna, not any category Iron Hollow had ever used to measure her and found her wanting. Something older, something they had never had the framework to see. She had not been too weak for the pack. The pack had simply been too small for what she was. She came back to herself in the snow, with her hands pressed flat to the ground, and the runes fading slowly back to beneath the surface. Kale was crouched in front of her. He had not touched her, but he was close, and his expression had lost the last of its careful management. Not raw, not dramatic, but fully, finally, present. A man who had caught the scent of something he could not categorize and followed it into the wilderness, and had now been shown exactly what it was. She looked up at him. "You saw it," she said. Not a question. "Enough of it," he said quietly. A beat of silence between them. The snow continued to fall. "Then you know," Elira said, "that I am not what anyone thought I was." Kale held her gaze. "No," he said. "You're not." He helped her to her feet. She did not need the help. Her legs had steadied by the time the last of the runes faded beneath the snow, but she accepted it, because accepting it was not the same as requiring it, and she had spent enough years refusing things out of pride to know the difference. His grip was brief, and entirely without presumption. He released her the moment she was upright. They stood in the clearing, with the snow falling between them and the mountain above them, and 5 years of solitude still settling around her shoulders, like something she was only now beginning to understand she could set down. Cale was quiet for a long moment, looking not at her but at the tree line, reading it the way she had learned to read it: exits, approaches, the geometry of visibility and cover. She recognized the calculation because she had performed it herself, daily, for years. But he was not calculating for himself. She understood that before he spoke. "The hunters who came through the lower range," he said. "How many times?" "Twice, in the last month." He absorbed this without visible reaction. Word travels in the Northern Territories faster than most packs admit. A scent that doesn't fit any known category, originating from a fixed location, on a mountain nobody's supposed to be living on. He paused. "People are already talking. Let them talk." "Elira," he said her name with a directness that suggested he had been thinking it for some time. "If the wrong pack reaches this mountain before they understand what you are, they will not stop to understand. They will move to contain, to control." He looked at her then, fully. "Or remove." She held his gaze. "You're saying I'm not safe." "I'm saying you were never hidden. You were just not yet found." He said it without apology, because it was not a thing that required apology. It was simply true. And she was learning. A man who delivered truth with the same flat economy he delivered everything else. The runes, the healing field, the storms that stop short of this clearing. None of that is invisible to a pack that knows what to look for. And there are packs that know. The wind moved through the spruce trees at the clearing's edge. One of the ravens had returned. She could hear it in the upper branches, its particular low, conversational sound, and she took a small, steadying breath. "So what do you want?" she asked. The question landed in the space between them with a weight she had intended. She had spent 5 years alone on a mountain learning to ask direct questions, because indirect ones wasted time she could not spare. She watched Cale receive the question and process it with the unhurried attention he gave everything, and she watched carefully for what surfaced in his expression. Not calculation, not the particular arrangement of features that preceded a negotiation. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked, in a man she suspected was rarely conflicted about anything, remarkably like conflict. "What I want," he said slowly, "and what I came here intending." He stopped, revised. "I followed a scent into the northern wilderness because something in me recognized it as significant. I did not come here with a plan for what to do once I found the source. I came here because I could not come." He paused. "That is not a position I am accustomed to." "And the bond," Elira said. "And the bond." She watched him. "An alpha in your position," she said, "with a mate bond to something the northern packs would consider a significant power. There is a version of this where you claim it. Claim me. Fold me into Darkfen's protection under your name. It would be strategically rational." "Yes," he said, "and it would be wrong." The word fell between them simply. Not accusatory, just true. Something shifted in him at it, not surprise, but recognition. The expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion through his own reasoning and has just heard it spoken aloud by someone else. "I don't claim what was never meant to be owned," he said. The clearing was very quiet. Elira looked at him for a long moment. This man who had followed her scent through a wilderness he didn't know, who had stood in a circle of ancient light and seen what she was, who was choosing, with full knowledge of what he was setting aside, not to use it. "Then what are you offering?" she asked. He met her eyes. "To stand between you and the ones who would make a different choice." He did not return to Darkfen that night, or the next. His scouts came looking on the third day, 2 of them, moving carefully through the lower range, with the controlled urgency of men whose alpha had been unreachable for longer than protocol permitted. They found his trail at the tree line and followed it to the edge of the clearing and stopped there, reading what they found with the instincts of trained wolves. Their alpha, standing at the perimeter of a ruined cabin on an unmapped mountain. Not detained, not incapacitated, stationed. They returned south and said very little, because they understood with the bone-deep literacy of people who had served a precise and deliberate man for years that what they had witnessed was intentional. That Kale Draven was exactly where Kale Draven had decided to be. Word spread the way word always spread in the Northern Territories, outward in rings, each ring carrying less accuracy and more urgency than the one before it. By the time it reached the Eastern Pax, it had become something close to legend. The most powerful Alpha in the North is not coming back. He is guarding something on the mountain, something the mountain has been keeping. And then gradually, then all at once they came. Not warriors, not scouts sent to assess a strategic asset. Wolves who had traveled for days through difficult terrain, arriving at the lower range with the particular exhaustion of people who have moved towards something out of need rather than ambition. An Omega from the Eastern Territories whose injuries had not healed correctly in 3 years. A Beta whose pack had collapsed and who carried the particular hollowness of someone without belonging. An Elder who said she had dreamed about the mountain for a month and had eventually stopped arguing with the dream. They did not come for power. They came the way desperate things come toward warmth, not because they had been told to, but because something in them knew the direction. Elira stood at the edge of the clearing on a morning 3 weeks after the Night of the Runes, and looked down the slope at the figures moving through the lower forest, and felt something open in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Not fear, not the flat, managing calm she had built around herself as armor. Something older. Something that the vision had tried to show her and that she was only now, watching these wolves move through the snow toward the mountain, beginning to understand. This was what she was for. Not a pack, not a Luna, not an Omega or an Alpha, or any category that Iron Hollow had used to arrange its world. Something that existed in the space between all those categories, holding them together. A presence the land recognized, a thing the mountain had been keeping. Behind her, she heard Kale's footsteps in the snow unhurried, steady, taking up a position 2 steps back and 1 step to her right, not in front, not claiming the space, beside her, guarding what he had chosen not to possess. She did not turn around. She watched the wolves coming up the mountain toward the warmth they could feel from a distance, toward the something they could not yet name, and breathed the cold mountain air and let the truth of what she was settle, finally, fully, into the chest that had been carrying it for years without knowing what it held. They had cast her out at 10 years old. They had called her weak, called her defective, erased her name and her scent and her place, and pushed her into a winter wilderness with nothing, and closed the gate. They had been so certain they were discarding something without value. The mountain had known differently. It had been waiting for her all along. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.